Hello and welcome back to Recruiter 360 TV with me, Toby and Brian MacNeice. Brian is the co-author of Powerhouse, one of the best books I've read about the whole concept of high-performance organisations. We're going to be talking we've talked a little bit so far about the pillars behind the whole concept of a powerhouse. We've been speaking about a few of the characteristics. We want to talk a little bit more now about resilience.
Yeah.
One of the key features of high-performance people as well as organisations, I think. Tell us about your thoughts there.
Yeah, so for us, resilience was an important characteristic. As you say, at an individual level, what you find in high-performance individuals is they tend to be very resilient. They tend to be able to navigate the various different bounces that you might get, because there's no single path to high performance.
Yeah.
You know, it's a bit of a winding road, and occasionally you might get knocked off course or whatever. So
Yeah.
so high performance individuals tend to kind of recover very quickly and
Yeah.
kind of stay on track. And so what we were interested in was understanding, well, what does a high performance kind of resilient organization look like?
Yeah.
And is that a capability that you can develop within an organization in a deliberate way? And our conclusion is that absolutely, you can. So there's probably a couple of important elements to how an organization becomes resilient. I think the first is that what we found is the high performance organizations tend to be ones that suffer less crises in the first instance. And that's not because they're lucky, it's because that they anticipate some of the risks downstream,
Okay.
and they manage and mitigate against those risks, and they also think about, well, what can we do in order to prevent it happening in the first instance?
Exactly, yeah.
So if you look at some of the operational processes that are designed into systems in Toyota, for example, they're continually looking at some of the manufacturing risk factors and anticipating kind of, you know, where problems might lie, and coming up with solutions in advance to try and prevent things from actually occurring or happening in the first instance. I remember very, very early in my career learning a very important lesson. I was working on a big IT project, and I was responsible for the risk register on the project.
Okay.
And so my job was to kind of categorize all these risks and effectively log them and make sure that, you know, they were being kind of tracked, etc. And something went wrong on the project. And I was very proud of the fact that I looked up my risk register, and there it was in black and white. I kind of had identified this as a potential risk,
Yeah.
and I was delighted with myself. And look, see, I anticipated this, and I got the landing of my life when the kind of the partner on the project that I was working with said to me, you know, well, what did you do about it? What did you put in place in order to mitigate against that?
Yeah.
You know. Your job wasn't to identify the risk, it was to try and figure out, well, what can we do to kind of prevent this from happening and be prepared if it does happen so that it doesn't knock us off course. And it was a real lesson to me that that's what it's about. And so what you find is high performance organizations, resilient organizations, tend to be very good at anticipating and mitigating and having processes in place
Yeah.
around all that stuff.
Almost like a disaster recovery aspect.
Yeah, and so it doesn't become such a big crisis,
Yeah.
and knock them so far off course when it does happen. And that's the second element of it. No matter how much you can plan for these things, stuff happens.
Yeah.
You know, the market goes against you. There's a kind of catastrophic event that might happen, or you know, you know, there's all sorts of things that can happen in an organizational context that can knock you off course. So accept that at some point some of that stuff is going to happen. And so it's how do we ensure that as quickly as possible we reaffirm where we were trying to go, we lock back into that journey that we were on in terms of our kind of future vision and ambition challenge and where we're trying to get to. And as quickly as possible, we get back on track and aim for there. Or if we feel that that's fundamentally changed the goalposts, then very quickly figure out, well, what are the new goalposts, and get the organization completely aligned behind that and moving forward and working very hard to deliver against that. So the second element of a really resilient organization is accepting that stuff will go wrong at some point. And it's how we react to that and how we ensure that very quickly we build reconfidence within the organisation and recommit to where we were trying to get to. That kind of really matters, and that's going to help us get there.
That confidence is so important in an organisation, isn't it? It's momentum. I'm a big believer in momentum and the whole importance of it in any sports team, any business, any organisation. Full stop. And that momentum bred through confidence, and that confidence bred through focus, is a critical aspect. Yeah,
absolutely. I agree with that completely. And then for me, the third component part is the extent to which the organisation itself cultivates a growth mindset as part of the cultural DNA of the organisation.
Yeah.
So I'm a massive fan of the work of Carol Dweck, the notion of fixed versus growth mindset, and cultivating a growth mindset in individuals. And I think that applies as much in an organisational context as it does in an individual context.
Yes.
And so I do a lot of work with organisations trying to figure out, well, how do we go about ensuring that the organisation has a growth mindset, and that all of the people within the organisation are encouraged to think and act in a growth mindset way. So one of the component parts of that is creating really strong feedback-rich culture. Growth mindset people are people who embrace feedback and use it in order to try and continually identify how they can improve. So building a strong feedback-rich culture in an organisation is important to that. Growth mindset people are people who regard setbacks as opportunities to recommit to kind of where they want to get to.
Which ties,
and so again, building that into the DNA of the organisation is an important element of how you cultivate that as a culture. And growth mindset people are people who aren't afraid to be challenged, who aren't afraid to take on ambition challenges, who aren't afraid to question how can we get better, and who aren't afraid of hard work and recognise that hard work is the currency of performance, and that you don't get there without having to work really hard. And so again, cultivating that into the mindset and the organisational DNA is
there's
a really
selection
important
aspect on that as well, isn't it? There's the whole concept of talent versus hard work, and how sometimes talented people don't want to be seen as weak by admitting to being hard workers alongside that. I think Matthew Syed wrote a lot about football academies, and how suddenly it doesn't become cool to be the hard worker in there, and those are the guys who generally tend to come through, and the guys there who are the most talented can sometimes fall off the face of it.
Yeah, absolutely. In my book, nothing replaces hard work. As I said, it's the fundamental currency of performance.
I agree.
And high performance organisations are exactly the same. The high performance organisations that I've studied are hard working, and that kind of champion that hard work ethic. Now, do it in a way that is still balanced, right? But so not kind of flog people to death, because that's not sustainable over a long period of time. But recognise that, look, what we're doing is going to require tough, hard work. We've got to put the shoulder to the wheel. We'll do that, and then we'll recognise and celebrate success when it gets delivered.
Because exceptional ambition requires exceptional effort, doesn't it, to get to that sort of stage?
And for me, attitude trumps aptitude all day long. So I would much prefer to have somebody who has that kind of fundamental hard work ethic over somebody who is super talented and mightn't necessarily, in fact, kind of demonstrate some of that fixed mindset that Matthew Syed would talk about, where they cherish the fact that they're naturally very good, and so the more that they have to work at something, almost questions their underlying talent in the first instance, and therefore
very interesting,
that's not a good thing, that's a bad thing. No, I completely agree with Matthew Syed. I think I would always look for the guys who work the hardest, because they're the ones ultimately who are going to come through.
The other thing that was really interesting to me was, and we've studied this for a long time, it's one of the core values of our business, is Kaizen. And no better exemplar of that than Toyota, who I guess wrote the book on it, right? Tell us a little bit what you saw there.
Yeah, so we saw exactly what everybody would expect you to see in a Toyota context. That notion of continuous improvement is so deeply ingrained in everything that they do, and has been written about by a lot of different people. It was kind of, it was something that we were a little bit nervous about for that reason,
I think it's good to share it from a number of different eyes, isn't it?
Yeah,
and what you'll read about in the book isn't the same as what you read about in other organisations.
Yeah, so we give our own take on that within the book and provide our own context. But essentially, what you see is that a very deliberate organisational commitment to continually ask searching questions about how we keep getting better, and always assuming that we have never cracked it and that there's always room for improvement. And built into the operational processes and the governance model of the organisation itself, in order to ensure that that's what gets delivered. And when we compared that, so it was obvious in a Toyota context, but we compared that to all the other organisations that we studied, and guess what? We saw exactly the same thing.
Continuous improvement in the DNA.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in the New Zealand All Blacks, they talk about playing the perfect game and then repeating it the next week. And so, they could beat a team.
It's the rhetoric of Eddie Jones at the moment.
50 or 60-0, absolutely.
Yeah.
No matter how well they performed in a given week, there's always something that they can identify that they can improve on. And so they'll work pretty hard to identify those work-ons.
The Red Arrows do that brilliantly.
Red Arrows do it all the time. The US Marines do it. In the Finnish state school education system, the teachers in Finland do it all the time. They're continually questioning their teaching techniques. The teachers in Finland are given a lot of latitude to figure out how best to teach. They're all highly qualified, they're master degree qualified, and they're respected for the profession and the importance of the profession that is teaching in Finland. Not in the same way that you would see, say, here in the UK. And so they're continually asking themselves challenging questions about, how can I get better? How can I apply new innovative techniques to my teaching in order to deliver the outcomes that my students expect, which is a high standard of education right across the board in every high school in Finland. So you see it there. You see it in the Mayo Clinic, in Médecins Sans Frontières, even though they're operating in very, very extreme, difficult conditions in war-torn countries or in areas of natural disaster, they still have certain standards about how they go about doing what they do, and they don't compromise on those standards, and they're continually asking themselves challenging questions about how do they get better in the circumstances
that questioning
that they
is so
work
important,
in.
isn't it? People making sure that they're questioning what they're doing, even if they're doing well. How can they do it better? How can they add on to it? I think it's one of the the central high performance traits, isn't it?
I think if you stop asking yourself that question, then you stop developing. And so I think, again, you see that in an individual, but what we're talking about is in an organizational context. And so making sure that the organization forces itself to ask those tough questions all the time is a really important element of it. And, we help organizations to design some of those processes. I talked in one of the previous episodes about a kind of quarterly planning cycle that we kind of design with senior management teams that's very effective. And fundamental to that is that continual questioning of, are we doing enough to continually improve, and where can we continually get better? And once you stop asking that question, I think you stop becoming a long-term sustainable high performer, because eventually you just will stop improving. Yeah.
Well, look, there's so much more than we can be talking about on this, but I know we're getting short on time. You can read all of the rest of it in here, and it is well worth a read. So I'm going to ask you one final question, and it's a question I ask everyone at the end of the show, which is, if there's one thing that you could take away to give to people about the piece of advice around high performance, what would that be? It's a big question.
It is a big question, yeah. So I'm tempted to repeat some of the stuff that we've just talked about, so I'm not going to do that. So take that as a given, right? That notion of commitment to hard work and continual improvement, etc. Always challenging yourself. One of the things that we discovered as part of this whole research process was that human beings, people, are very reactive beings. We're very much shaped by the environment around us. And depending on how that environment is set up, that influences our behavior, and in my terms, performance. Yeah. And so one of the conclusions that we drew from the research was that there are a specific set of circumstances that you can create around a group of people that will stimulate a reaction called better performance. And so my big takeaway, if you are responsible in any way for managing people in an organization, then your job is to create the right environment around your people that will stimulate a reaction called better performance. And you need to be thinking about what is it that you're doing to create that right environment all the time.
Yeah.
And obviously the kind of various different principles that we talk about in the book and the Powerhouse model, in our view, is how you go about doing that. But I would want you as a manager, as a people leader, as a team leader, as a supervisor, as a senior executive, whatever level you are in an organization, thinking about what am I doing to create the right performance environment around my people, and how do I go about deliberately designing that? Because
and that becomes an obsession, doesn't it?
It does become an obsession, and it also it's something that happens by design, not by accident.
Yeah.
All the high performance organizations that we study are there because they're doing that. They're creating the right environment around their people to stimulate performance, and so it happens as a direct consequence of that. It's not luck.
Yeah.
It's not chance. Great organizations are made; they're not born.
Yeah.
And so your job in your organization is to think about, well, what am I doing to create the right environment that's helping stimulate performance around my team, and stimulate performance around my organization.
Yeah.
So that's probably, I'm not sure if that directly answers the question that you're asking.
100%. Because there's various different levels of people looking at various different things, and I think it's a cut and paste process for a number of different people. But that sort of obsession with high performance environments, if you generally want to get there, I couldn't agree more that it's so important to think about what you're doing and all the little things, that the marginal gains, the continuous improvement, all those things that you put together is so important to what you do.
Yeah. So for me, it's about, again, if I go back to the kind of the structure of the Powerhouse model, it's thinking about how do we set our people up to try and achieve something ambitious in the first instance, and kind of be clear about how they're going to do that and why that matters. How are we going to make sure at any point in time that I'm keeping them abreast of how we're doing against that, and continually updating the kind of the key priorities for what we work on at any point in time? How am I building the operational processes around how we manage the organization? How am I creating the right culture within the organization? And if you get all those elements of the environment right, then you're going to create an environment that's going to stimulate performance improvement.
Well, Brian, it's been brilliant. Thanks so much for joining us.
Absolute
Thanks so much
pleasure.
for sharing so much insight into the brilliant book and what you've been doing. How do people get in touch with you?
So they can get in touch via email, so kotinospartners.com. My contact details and James's contact details as the two authors of the book are there. There's a website for the book itself, the performancepowerhouse.com. I'm very impressed with how
battered
well
and
worn
covered
that
in
book
coffee
is
and
actually.
notes.
Yeah, it's good to see that somebody's actually using it.
They do come better than that.
Yeah, no. I prefer them seeing it like that, because that means it's been used. And Kogan Page are our publishers, so you can kind of look up the book on Kogan Page or on Amazon or any of the usual kind of sites as well.
Great stuff. Well, listen, thanks so much for
Fantastic,
joining us.
absolute pleasure. Thank you.
We'll catch you again soon.
Thanks, Toby.
We'll see you all soon on another episode of Recruiter 360 TV very soon. Thank you.